All right, so I know we've got kind of a accelerated schedule, so I'm not going to give. I've got like maybe 60 or 80 slides. I don't know, something like that. No, not really that many. Something like 30 slides. But so what I do for VMware, my contact information's right down here at the bottom. But I work in technical marketing for the Storage and Availability Business Unit. That's kind of a mouthful. We call it SABU. And what I do at SABU is really work with PMs as well as the other different groups within VMware around solutions specific to virtual SAN. Like something I'm working on right now is an updated stretch cluster guide for vSAN 6.2. Also looking at possibly some documentation around stretch clusters and VDI, different things like that. So that's kind of what I do at VMware. I've been there about a year now, and I used to work at EMC in the federal space. Supporting federal customers kind of in a SE type role. So here are a couple of things we're going to cover today. Again, I'm going to try to run through a good bit of this. I don't have any slides specific to the new 6.2 announcements. I can roll that in if you'd like as well. I will cover it as I'm covering some of the content. But we're going to go over kind of an overview of virtual SAN if you're not familiar with it, really kind of how to size and design it for a virtual desktop environment, then some of the choices you have as far as choosing hardware, and then kind of a summary around licensing and some different things like that, okay? So this is kind of the VMware strategy when it comes to a new term we're using, and let me get out of the way here, hyperconverged software. You've seen HCI, hyperconverged infrastructure, different things like that. So from a software perspective, if you look at vSphere, vCenter, and also virtual SAN with a couple other pieces added on top like NSX, vRealize Operations, Log Insight, Horizon kind of to some degree as far as the HCS side of things. This is really our SDDC strategy, if you will, right? Specific to providing a hyperconverged solution on top of pretty much anybody's hardware as far as that goes. Okay, so we're really going to focus today on the use case, and I think I'll stay over here and quit moving around so much, but we're going to focus on end-user computing, obviously based on the topic of the day being EUC Day. Okay, so if you're not familiar with virtual SAN, we do require from a minimum hardware complement 3 hosts up through version 6.0. 6.1 introduced the capability of running a minimum of 2 hosts with an external witness. That witness can be a freely provided or freely available virtual appliance to handle the witness type functions, or you can use another host if you like. The challenge I would say from using another host is you're going to burn a license there, whereas the witness does not require a particular license to run. Okay, so just something important to keep in mind. Now, we can scale up to 64 nodes in an individual cluster. I think from an EUC perspective, we recommend the largest cluster size being 32. I think that ceiling's going to come off at some time before too long, but we really recommend no more than 32 currently with shipping versions of Horizon View, okay? Now, at least 3 of those hosts in a normal config must contribute storage. If you're running a 2-node config, then only 2 have to contribute storage. We use a combination of, here we say flash devices and magnetic disks as locally attached devices. We do use, bless you, we do use flash or SSD style devices as a cache tier, and then we use for a capacity tier. And I'm not going to say only magnetic disks or traditional disks, but either or, depending on whether we choose an all-flash configuration or a hybrid configuration. Then we also, from a network connectivity perspective, we recommend at least 10 gig minimum internode connectivity. You do not have to dedicate all that to virtual SAN. If you have a hybrid config, we do support a dedicated 1 gig connection in that case, so you don't necessarily have to have 10 gig. But we do recommend 10 gig for hybrid, and then we support nothing less than 10 gig with all flash. Okay, so here's just kind of a breakdown of what we're seeing as far as the different architecture styles. On the left, we've got all flash. We're stating 100,000 IOPS per host, all right, which is a really good number, if you will, especially in an EUC type environment. If you think about a minimum complement of 4 nodes, that's 400,000 IOPS. I think that's a particular 100% read random, if you will, benchmark. But with that being said, I've talked to some customers who have hit 150,000 IOPS on a single node as an average. right? Or not as an average, as a peak rather. So it really all depends on the complement. If you notice at the top, we've got our cache tier, and then we've also got our capacity tier below it, solid state on the left, with traditional drives on the right. We would call the architecture on the left all flash, the architecture on the right hybrid. Those metrics are coming from a very small, very conservative configuration of virtual SAN, okay? I think my next slide will cover, my next slide covers kind of how we fit devices within a host. Okay, and this is really paramount when it comes to sizing VDI on top of virtual SAN. If you'll notice, here's a host. We've got 5 individual disk groups. A disk group is comprised of one cache device and one or more capacity devices. So if it's hybrid, traditional spinning drives for your capacity tier. If it's flash, then this tier is going to be solid state as well. So we can have up to 35 capacity devices on any individual node. Now, depending on the architecture, whether it's flash or hybrid, you can see some pretty large capacity sizes when it comes to that, okay? You do not have to employ all of this. You can literally start with one cache device and one capacity device and grow up within a host, or you can grow out across multiple hosts, however you'd like to do it, right? Yes, sir?
Is that 35?
Capacity, 5 cache and 35 capacity, yeah. So if you think of some of the approved drives on our hardware compatibility list, which I'll get into a little bit later, we've got some 6 terabyte approved devices. So if you think of that, 35 6 terabyte devices in a single host, you can get some very large capacity sizes. Now, you may or may not need them. It's just from a technical perspective, that's what we can support. Now, this is really kind of, some of the same conversations that you guys already have every day when it comes to sizing vSphere itself when it comes to virtual desktops, right? Things like how many virtual CPUs per desktop, the amount of average utilization, and so on, right? We typically say from a Horizon View perspective, about 10% or less additional overhead, and then from a virtual SAN perspective, and these numbers are current as of 6.1, an average of 10% CPU or less per host, all right, as far as an overhead goes. Okay, this is not anything that we have to individually manage a particular storage VM or anything. It's all built in within the kernel, within vSphere. Now, we did announce a couple weeks ago vSAN 6.2, which will be part of the vSphere 6.0 Update 2 release. We added some additional features, and I can cover those a little bit later. I don't have a slide for them to try to keep this short, but if you add deduplication and compression, as well as erasure coding and some other overhead, this could conceivably go up to about 15% CPU. Okay, so it's actually not a large footprint, if you will, when it comes to, from a CPU sizing perspective. Now, memory's a little bit different. You do have to, obviously the same way you would with any other view environment, you have to think about things like host overhead, memory overhead, and so on. But when it comes to the virtual SAN side of things, and I've got actually a KB article listed here. When it comes to that, depending on the number of disk groups you have, the amount of cache you have, the amount of cache size, those things all come into play when it comes to sizing virtual SAN from a memory requirement. Okay. Now, with that being said, if I have virtual SAN across, I think it's less than 32 hosts, I only require 3 gigs per host for the core vSAN memory footprint, if you will, right? As I add those cache size or additional cache devices, that's going to grow, and I think I've got that detailed on the next slide, right? Yeah. So it's a lot of math. You can look at every bit of it right here in this particular KB article, 208-0467. And these are just some examples, right? So at the top, 2 disk groups per host in a hybrid config with 400 gig solid state devices for the cache size. So in this particular config, we see that we only require 5.6 gigs of additional memory, right, out of that footprint. Now, if you think about the servers of today with, 128, 192, 256, 512 gigs of RAM, this is really a pretty insignificant footprint from a memory perspective. Now, something that I have not updated these slides yet, but we also added something with 6.2 called client cache. If you're very familiar with Horizon View and what View Storage Accelerator, I think is the product name, or content-based read cache, CBRC. With Virtual SAN 6.2, we've also added that for the storage side as well with Virtual SAN. So we can actually take up to a gig of RAM and dedicate that toward additional storage read caching, right? Whether a VM is running on one host and the storage resides other places, we also add that read cache there, right? So that's a new enhancement. So you could add that as well to some of that overhead. All right, any questions so far? You guys look really bored or really hungry? One, I don't know. Okay. All right, so when it comes over here so I can actually see this and make sure I get all the different pieces covered. So if you're not familiar with Virtual SAN, it's a departure from traditional storage in that we do not size any LUNs. We don't have any particular RAID groups or fast pools or anything like that, right? As far as that goes, we have storage policies that really are going to completely affect the way that our capacity is used, right? Now we also have, keep in mind, Virtual SAN itself is an object store. And you'll hear things like the Virtual SAN file system. It's actually a file disk, it's a disk type rather than a file system itself, right? So where that is important is the number of components, okay? And what I mean by components is a VMDK by itself, less than 255 gigs, is a component, okay? A VMDK that is 1 terabyte in space, because our maximum component size is 255 gigs, is then one object with 4 components to it, okay? If I add additional policies to it, like I want to protect from a failure, an FTT of 1, I mentioned FTT at the top, failure tolerate of 1, I now have a copy of those. So where before I had 4 components for a 1 terabyte disk, I now have 8 components because I have 2 copies of that. Okay, so all those things come into effect. I talked about network briefly. Something that's very important to keep in mind when it comes to your disk groups. Do I want to size with just a single disk group, or do I want to size across multiple disk groups? And you'll see where this kind of makes a little sense in a minute. As far as cache capacity, when it comes to Virtual SAN, how big do I need to make that cache? Do I want to, again, back to disk groups. Do I want to have 1 disk group, 2 disk groups, 3 disk groups, whatnot? Talked about CBRC a little bit, and then the largest size, again, that we support is 32 with View today. Okay, so this is the FTT policy. We introduced a new one in 6.2 called FTM, Failure Tolerance Method. FTT, failure to tolerate. If you notice here in the depiction, I've got 4 hosts. The VM is residing on the first host. I have an FTT of 1 policy, and because of that particular policy, I'm writing a disk here and a disk here. That's a mirror copy. So think from a capacity perspective. If I have a 40 gig VMDK, and I'm writing to host 2 and host 3, I have 40 and 40. Okay, so I'm using twice the amount of capacity. Okay, it's ugly, but that's the way we do it. Everything is thin when it comes to Virtual SAN unless we use an object space reservation. I'll get into that in a minute, where that may be important in a View environment, right? And then we also have a witness component. And the reason we have a witness component is if one of these goes away and then comes back later, the witness gives the second vote, and that we have to have at least 50% of our objects available to determine which one is the active data set, right? If a host were to go down, a drive were to go bad, something like that. Okay, any questions so far? Now, disk stripes per object, you can think of this as kind of like a RAID 0 way of doing things, right? If you notice on the left, well, first off, the VM itself has both an FTT policy of 1 and then also a stripe width policy of 2. And what I'm doing here with this particular disk is I'm writing 2 different components here of the one object being the disk, and then 2 components here. Now, the reason that we showed it this way is because we can't necessarily, or we don't necessarily rather, distinguish whether or not those stripes reside on the same hosts or across multiple hosts. Mike, if you'd like a copy of these slides, you're welcome to them. But with that being said, and I've got 4 hosts here, if I had a 10 host cluster, or I had a 20 host cluster or whatnot, those could entirely be spread across all of those, right? Now, from a failure to tolerate policy perspective, with an FTT of 1, I have to have at least 3 hosts. With an FTT of 2, I have to have at least 5. With an FTT of 3, I have to have at least 7. All right, so there's a little algorithm specific to that, and we've got it in plenty of our documentation. Now, what it's important to keep in mind is if I'm deploying, let's say, a replica with a link clone config or multiple full clones, whatnot, with VDI, if I have stripe width, let's say, of 2 here, I could have one stripe reside across these 2 and then a witness, but yet the other stripe reside across this one and the witness, or the witness can be here. They can be completely intertwined and be completely spread across the entire cluster to really fully utilize the capability of all the I/O across all the hosts in the cluster, okay?
Is that related to a specific disk group, or is it, like, how does it make that determination?
It's PFM, pure freaking magic. Now, I used to work with Mike, so I have to give him a hard time, right? Now, we've got some algorithms as far as the layout goes, right? As far as that goes, but like these 2, these are green, depicting they're part of the same, I'll say, mirrored pair, right? So it's going to ensure that these components never reside on the same disk group that these components reside on. Right, now, with that being said, these guys are independent here. I could literally have this one over there and whatnot, right? It really all depends on capacity, policy, how well we can align with those policies and all those different pieces. So it does get very complicated. We have had some feature requests where people would like to set affinity, if you will, for objects. And, I want this object to be on this host and that type of thing, and we haven't exposed that at this time. Okay? Now, a couple of other, don't really need necessarily any graphics for them. A couple of the other policies, force provisioning. Where this is important is with Virtual SAN, if you go to deploy a workload on Virtual SAN and you cannot satisfy the policy requirements. So if I have an FTT of 1 and I have to have 3 hosts, but one host is offline for patching or maintenance or whatnot, I cannot satisfy that policy, and as a result, I can't provision. Can't power on, right? As far as that goes. So force provisioning is used in a case where if you want to ensure that if I don't have enough resources, I don't do anything. But you can disable that and say, okay, well, I planned for this particular failure. I'll change the policy and make it where I can either provision or whatnot. Think of like a stretch cluster config where one site's offline, it's missing its mirrored pair, but I still want to be able to operate while I'm working on that primary, right? That type of thing. Flash recache reservation is really only available in the hybrid configs, and what this does is that cache size that we have in each of the disk groups, 30% of that in a hybrid config is for write acceleration, 70% is for read acceleration, okay, in hybrid. In all flash, 100% of the flash is available for writes in the cache side. Now, the read cache flash read cache reservation, where that is important is, let's say you have a hybrid VDI environment running link clones, and you've got a replica and you wanted to add a large cache reservation to that particular object, right, to get better read performance off of that, because we're going to need better reads off of a replica, that type of thing. Now, object space reservation is kind of like, I'd call it another way of saying lazy zeroed thick. Right? So with an object space reservation of 100%, I'm saying pre-allocate that space on Virtual SAN, right? Think about a full clone virtual desktop environment where you want to ensure that everything is spread evenly across the environment, right? You would do that. You would set a space reservation of 100%, that type of thing. You may want to do a space reservation of 100% on, let's say, profiles or whatnot, right? If you're using persona disks or that type of thing. Now, by default, while I'm thinking about it, virtual swap files in every version, actually including 6.2 when it comes out, swap files are automatically 100% reserved. Now, in 6.2, I kind of call this claim to fame, it's probably not mine, but we were talking several months ago about what if we size our environment well enough where we don't overcommit any memory, and we want to take that virtual swap file and we want it to be thin as well. So in 6.2, we actually have a capability of being able to have that provisioned thin as well. And I think I saved like 4 terabytes of my vSAN environment just by doing that. All right. So here are some particular policies specific to Vue. Now, this is Vue shipping 6.2.2 or whatever the latest is, as well as Horizon, or as well as Virtual SAN up to 6.1. Okay, I'm sure we're going to have some updated stuff coming out with 6.2 and then the announced Horizon 7 very shortly. As far as full clones, 100% reserved, like I talked about before, right? Your object space reservation of 100%. Link clones, we do recommend that the OS disk is thin provisioned, a cache reservation of at least 10% for the replica. Again, that can be different for your environment. I think there was a particular blog post that one of my colleagues, Cormac Hogan, posted a while back, where if you tried to deploy Horizon View on top of Virtual SAN and you had an all-flash configuration, you could run into a particular situation where you couldn't provision. And the reason is this cache reservation was being made, but yet all-flash does not have that as a available policy, and therefore the policy could not be satisfied and you couldn't deploy. So there was a little tweak, right, as far as that goes. All right, this is very important right here, failure to tolerate of 1, okay? The reason that's important, and this is really specific to anything that you find valuable, okay, that you don't want to have to clean up, you don't want to have to put back together through whatever super difficult way of doing it. And what I mean is there was a recommendation at one point to have a failure tolerate of 0, let's say on non-persistent link clones, right? Well, and I'm not certain who came up with that recommendation, but if you think about it, what happens if I have an FTT of 0 and either the host or the device that either replica is on or a link clone is on or whatnot? What happens if it's FTT of 0 and that device goes away? It's gone. It's not there. Well, Horizon has no visibility into vSAN today as far as knowing that that's gone. Now, I can have a VM running on host number 4, but the disk running on host number 1, and if host number 1 goes down, then I've effectively pulled the storage out from under that VM, right? If I have an FTT of 1, the storage is going to be on another device as well, on another host, okay, or in another fault domain, right? So that's very important. Stripe width, we do recommend just a value of 1 unless your particular environment could benefit from more, right? And that's one of those things that you can literally play with it and change it as you will and watch it as it behaves, right? Okay, components I talked about previously. I didn't talk about any of the maximums, but with Virtual SAN 5.5, which is with vSphere 5.5 update 1 and above, we can only support up to 3,000 components per host. Okay, 9,000 is the maximum we support today in vSphere 6. Now, where that's important is, and we've got a KB article on this, I don't know if I have it mentioned, but some of the possible objects, if you notice on the right, things like the namespace. The namespace is like the VMX file, any log files, in VRAM, so on and so forth. VMDKs are their own, swap files are their own, any snaps. If you think about it from a VDI perspective, internal, as we're going and we're provisioning and we add that internal disk, briefly as we're going in and bringing it into Active Directory, that type of thing, right? Those are the different things that could contribute to the number of components. Oops. Okay, and then I've kind of got it broken down here as far as the component counts, right? So as we go to size view on top of vSphere, on top of vSAN, and we have that component count limit, it's important to remember that a replica itself is going to take 9 and a floating link clone, right? The desktop itself is going to take 9. Now, I think we only support today up to, I think we've validated and tested up to 200 desktops per host. But that's one of those your mileage may vary type situations, right? Where you could conceivably get more depending on the type of workers you have, the type of use cases, right? As far as that goes. All right, and we have all of this in a KB article as well, and I'm just watching my time to make sure I get everything, so I'm going to move on a little bit. So here's some of the examples as far as how you calculate the number of components. You'll see that the 9,000 is a pretty easy number to meet, right? So at the top, 500 desktops, 7 components, we calculate out as 10,500 components total. I'm not going to do this on anything less than 3 hosts, so as long as I meet the requirement of 10.5, then I'm good. Well, 3 hosts will do 27,000 components. So from a component count, I'm not going to run into an issue. But if we go further and we add an FTT of 3 with a stripe width of 12, and so on down the line, that's going to split that up even further, and that's where we get closer to our component counts. Okay? Does that make sense? Everybody with me so far? Okay. All right, so disk sizing. Cache should be about 10% of your protected VM storage. Now, what that means is if you have, if you're going to consume 4 terabytes of capacity, then you need about 400 gigs of cache, okay? And that's really the basics to it. Now, there's been some back and forth. Well, you know, is that 4 terabytes unprotected, or is it 4 terabytes protected, or whatnot? And I personally try to recommend based on protection included. I think all of our official documentation says just based on what you're going to consume. Okay. Now, with that being said, capacity should be evenly distributed across all hosts. What that really means is we highly recommend that you have a uniform environment. Now, that's not to say that you have to, but as far as the behavior of the environment, how to plan as far as sizing, all those other pieces, it's a little bit easier if all your components match. That's not to say, though, that today you have a particular config and 3 years after a lease is up, you start rolling servers in and rolling servers out in a rolling upgrade perspective. You could do that as well, and it would be not necessarily balanced at that point, right? It's important to remember that when it comes to the type of drives that you use, that your cache drives are designed to be write intensive or mixed workload. Okay, you'll see a term in some of our documentation that makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up called read intensive. Have you guys ever heard of a read intensive SSD? That's like saying a parking optimized car, right? I mean, it's kind of it's not a good way of saying it, right? But it's important to remember that the cache devices that you use are very, very write intensive. Okay. Okay. Now, so there it is, read intensive. I didn't do that, but as far as, these are some of the numbers from the EUC team as far as using hybrid with the top, at least 3 10K or 15Ks if you're using full clone, or that's with link clones, if you're using full clones, 4 10Ks or 7,200 RPMs per disk group. Now, obviously, you have to look at the amount of capacity and where that kind of fits in as far as that goes. All flash, again, recommend read-intensive drives. I hate that. Now, I have not updated this slide for the new recommendations with what was announced for Horizon 7 with instant clones. We're still working on some of that internally. And I'll also mention that when it comes to all-flash configurations, that from an all-flash perspective, if you add some of the new features that are available for all flash only, deduplication and compression, as well as erasure coding, then capacity sizes we're seeing are actually, or price per gig costs are actually going down with flash and are in fact much more attractive than hybrid going forward, right? This is really, really important too, the 130% of total capacity. What that is that additional 30% is overhead and slack space. Okay, it's not Slack like the Slack client or whatnot, but Slack as in give me a little room to breathe, right? Think about maintenance operations where I bring a host offline to patch it. If I choose to have all the components on that host move to another host for availability, then I've got to have room for that, right? If I have a failure and I go into a particular situation where I'm doing rebuilds, I need to have capacity for that type of thing. Important thing that people a lot of times forget when it comes to virtual SAN compared to traditional storage arrays. Most traditional storage arrays, when you go and actually consume the storage itself, you're consuming storage with some protection already on it, whether it be RAID 5, RAID DP, whatever, right? You've already lost some of that capacity. The numbers that we're using in virtual SAN are raw numbers. You get to apply policies to choose what level of protection and what level of redundancy and what level of striping and whatnot on your own, right? So that's something that, people will look at, oh, I can get vendor X's array, this much capacity and so on. Well, keep in mind that some of that is already consumed, right, and theirs. I'll just go through this one really briefly. I know we've got just a few more minutes, but when it comes to things like app volumes, it's important to also keep in mind, especially if you use the persistent app volume capabilities, if you will, and I'm not the most app volume centric person, but those are also going to add additional components. So if you just add Office as one particular app volume, that's not really a large impact. But if you have Office and then you have some, let's say SAP, program or something else homegrown or whatnot, as you add all these different pieces, they're going to add additional objects to the environment. Okay. Now, from a hardware perspective, this is one of our updated slides. You can either go what we call vSAN ready nodes from a consumption model. Dell sells them, Supermicro sells them, Fujitsu sells them, Cisco has some. There's a wide variety. I think we've got most of them listed there. Lenovo, HP, and whatnot. Then we've got the engineered appliances. If you remember, at one point there was EvoRail. Really, EMC is focused in being the only company that's going to proceed forward with that under the moniker of VxRail. And then over here on the right, we've got Evo SDDC, which from EMC is called VxRack, VMware Edition. And then we've got some other vendors that are also going to be doing the same thing with Virtual SAN as far as the back end here, right? So it's any way you want it as far as this goes. Now,
when you get those ready nodes, does licensing come with those?
It depends on how you buy them.
Okay, so you can bundle up.
Yeah, and I'll show you guys in just a minute how to go and actually pick out ready nodes and literally get a SKU and go to CDW or whoever your favorite is to deal with and say, I want this SKU, and they can sell you that exact piece of gear, right? So here are some of the different profiles we introduced in 6.1. If you notice on the left, we've got HY and AF, HY hybrid. Some of the HY2s come in a single core or a single proc, some come in dual procs depending on the vendor. Vendors work with us to ensure that we've got a kind of a good distribution, if you will, as far as capabilities go. Here we're seeing 4,000 IOPS on the HY2, 80,000 IOPS on this particular all-flash config, whatnot, right? How many VMs you can expect for each, that type of thing. Now, that's not to say, though, that you couldn't say, okay, I want an all-flash or AF6 node with, right now I've got 8 1 terabyte drives in it. I want to double that and get 16 1 terabyte drives. If the chassis will support it, you can actually have, as part of the order, have them add additional drives. So you're not limited to this as this is the only thing you can buy. You can only get it this way. It doesn't work like that, right? You don't have to do that. Okay? Now, this is what we call the VCG or HCL for some of us old timers, that type of thing. If you notice that, and this is, if you go to vmwa.re/vsanhcl, I think is what it is. I wish I had it up here. If you go here and you pick which version of ESXi you want to run and which vendor you want to pick, and then choose either all profiles, it will give you a list of all those different offerings from that particular vendor, okay, and the SKUs where you can literally say, I want this one, right, as far as that goes. Now, if you want to build your own, and we completely support that as well. So if you already have vSphere hosts and you simply want to ensure that your controller is certified and your drives are certified, there's another link on that previous page kind of down toward the bottom. If you click on that, it'll bring you to this interface. And you can say, I want to pick the controller, the version of vSphere, and then the particular brand name, and it'll tell you either if your controller is supported or not. If it's not supported, it won't be listed, but if it is, it will be listed. It'll say what versions of vSphere, what driver versions we recommend, what BIOS versions and whatnot as far as firmware goes, or not BIOS, but firmware goes, as well as settings. Do you want to do this in a RAID mode, or you want to do it in a pass-through, or what, right? So you're not required to buy ready nodes or engineered appliances. You can literally use your existing gear if you'd like. As long as it's on the vSphere HCL, and then the other components are on the vSAN HCL or VCG, you're good to go as far as that goes. Okay, now, a good question is what can I expect? This is the vSAN TCO is probably not the best term for it, but vsantco.vmware.com, you can literally go in and say, I want to do virtual desktops. I want this many desktops. I want it to be all flash. This is how many users. This is how big the footprint is, blah, 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 blah. Tell me what I need. Boom. And it will show you every bit of this, right? Now, something else I'll talk about in just a minute is what we call our vSAN assessments. I'll get to that in just a second, but this will literally tell you, this is kind of the footprint that you need to get started. This is the latest update to our licensing, and I've got 1 or 2 slides, so I should be good on time. But from a licensing perspective, when it comes to Virtual SAN Standard, Advanced, or Enterprise, they're all licensed either per desktop or per CPU. Okay. With that being said, it does not matter whether or not a host is contributing storage or not. If a host is consuming storage, then it requires a license. Okay. Now, if you look at, I'm not going to go deep into all the features other than to say Horizon Advanced, bless you, Horizon Advanced and Enterprise support all flash, deduplication compression, RAID 5 and RAID 6 erasure coding, as opposed to mirroring for better space efficiency. Enterprise supports iOS limits, basically throttling, if you will. And then our stretch clusters are now in 6.2 supported with Enterprise. Now, where all this fits within a Horizon View environment perspective is, so if you notice the little asterisk here for Virtual SAN Advanced. Okay, Virtual SAN Advanced is included with the Horizon Advanced and Enterprise suites. So effectively, you get it for free if you're licensed for Horizon Advanced or Horizon Enterprise. Okay, free like in beer, free, right? Now, I will say that with version 6.1, stretch clusters were available in Advanced because we didn't have the Enterprise edition. In 6.2, stretch clusters have been moved to Enterprise, and one of the reasons why is we haven't seen a lot of interest in doing VDI with Virtual SAN and stretch clusters. And then we do that, and then a couple people, hey, wait a minute, I'm interested in that. So who knows, right, as far as that goes. But I will say one thing that's really interesting from a replication perspective, we have a 5-minute RPO if you're replicating from vSAN to vSAN data store using vSphere replication, which is probably already included in the version of vSphere that you own. Right, so you can use that as well for items other than virtual desktops, if you will. All right, so kind of a summary. As far we say this internally within storage and availability, if we're not conveying that, not just from a cost perspective, but an ease of deployment perspective, flexibility of hardware and whatnot, if you're running Horizon View on anything other than Virtual SAN, then we're not doing our jobs right. I mean, it's, keep in mind, you're licensed with Horizon Enterprise, Horizon Advanced, to have this for free. All you have to have is the hardware, right? As far as cache devices, capacity devices, and controllers. It's not any additional cost as far as that goes. It's important to remember that when it comes to the sizing, you have enough cache, you have enough capacity, your policies, and I think I've got a longer deck on this somewhere that I can probably share as well. But when it comes to your fault tolerance, just because a VM is protected with an FTT of 0, or if your VM is protected on a couple hosts here, the VM may be residing on a completely different host, right? So it really doesn't matter whether a host is presenting storage or not, as far as that goes, in any particular environment. As far as options, ready nodes, engineered appliances like VxRail, Evo SDDC, available from quite a few vendors, and then or bring your own, as your own option, right? One of the great things that I think about around vSAN and Horizon is, and I know when I worked at my previous employer, and I'll try to wrap this up because I know we're right at time, it was always hard to do a POC for VDI because we would go and we'd say, we'll set up this huge array, because you're going to get to this many users at some point. And either VDI didn't get off the ground or the workload was different or whatnot. I think the great thing about vSAN is not only does it scale up and it scale out, but it can actually scale down, right? I can start off with small nodes for a pilot or whatever, and then I can come back and I can scale to much larger nodes, and it's easy to effectively scale right with VDI as the VDI workload changes, right? Now, a couple ways you can try it out and get started if you'd like. The hosted evaluation is really just our hands-on labs. I go to our hands-on labs and spin it up, play with it. You don't have to invest any time in setting it up or anything. It's ready to go. Tear it up, break it. It'll be destroyed in 5 days and then replaced with another one. If you have a VMUG Advantage membership, then you can actually get a year of Virtual SAN. I don't know how many sockets that is. I'm sure you can get more information actually at that URL as far as that goes. Everybody has, by default, Virtual SAN installed, or not installed, but capable on their hosts from vSphere 5.5 Update 1 and better. It's already included in the code. Only thing you have to do is turn it on, and it'll run for 60 days. And the last one I mentioned was the vSAN assessment. What this is any storage vendor is going to say, hey, let's install an agent, and we'll do we'll gather some data, and we'll give you an idea of what you need, as far as that goes. Well, really, all we do is we install a VIB, and that VIB basically takes your SCSI traces, right, and sends them up, and then after at minimum week's time, we'll say, okay, given what you've got, this is what it would take to match that environment, right, or have this much, additional or whatnot, Say that again? We don't have any visibility into non-vSphere workloads currently, right? Because we're loading a VIB that's taking the SCSI traces, right? Now, the interesting thing there, though, is also you could say, with that data, you could say, well, I need this many hybrid nodes or this many all-flash nodes, and you can kind of pick and choose, and it'll give you an idea of, what the best type of hardware is, and you can take that, put some numbers to it, and find out which might be the most cost-effective for your environment, right? I wish I had probably 2 or 3 more hours to go even deeper into this stuff, but it's there's a lot to it, and hopefully we'll have some more content coming up in the upcoming weeks and months specific to EUC and virtual SAN. Okay, and again, I'm Jace McCarty. You can reach me on Twitter at Jace McCarty. It's really hard to remember. If you're crafty enough, you can find my VMware email, but I don't really get it out. So I do appreciate the time. I wanted to bring some stuff here today. I actually have a couple stickers, but they didn't send me any swag, unfortunately.